Ooh, that sounds very official. So,
Mhm.
for the recording later, for those who are listening, today is Thursday, August 25th, 20, is it 2020? And this is our eighth monthly community call for ACRE DAOs, Autonomous Communities for Regenerative Economies. And, we wanted to talk about this really fantastic document that I shared with the community a couple of months ago, the playbook for using impact DAOs to change the world. And I'll say, like, it super resonated with me at the time because, I think we're a little bit unique in the space in that, we're not a DAO. We are a community. We have a social token that we've been using in a particular kind of way. But our vision that we've been fleshing out over the course of this first season is like a model of a federation of DAOs or a United Nations of DAOs or a flywheel of DAOs. I mean, our call to adventure has been since December, 1,000 DAOs in 1,000 days. And this first season, which is long, I think by Web3 standards, it's sort of a full 6 months, was designed to one, kind of slowly grow the community, get to know one another. We're fortunate that we've got like extraordinary people who've been attracted to this project and are really, really engaged in other projects. I mean, that's often our Discord's quiet, because people are such guns um, in other parts of the ecosystem. So we have Pupil joining us. Appt Pupil's the author of that playbook, and um, I just wanted to just give those comments just as a context of like with all of our big picture ambitions as a community of launching or servicing other communities. We didn't have a real structure around how to do that or what does that look like or an architecture or a tokenomics model. And so finding the playbook was like, oh, moment of like, this feels exactly like what we conceptually want to do, and maybe it's something very helpful in actually doing it. So with that, I'll just pause, and maybe people, if you would give a brief introduction and share what inspired you to write the playbook, and a little bit more of kind of how you envision communities using it in practice.
Absolutely. Yeah, I'll try not to ramble too much and getting too much into the weeds about myself and other things. But just to give a bit of context, I'm a bit older than probably most folks that are participating in the Web3 community and are relatively late to the space. So I've spent my years, probably more than I care to admit, in traditional organizations, doing a lot of work in those organizations around management of technology and also governance. And I've spent a lot of time thinking about those topics in that space and wrestling with the limitations that come from traditional organization structures and approaches in how to effectively make organizations successful in being able to achieve their purposes. And one of the things that inspired me about Web3 that really got me interested in the space after keeping kind of an eye on it for many years, but not really doing anything with it at all, was this concept of DAOs and really seeing it start to come to life through communities like this one. When I got involved, I expected that there would be a lot of innovative thinking and tremendous experimentation going on around governance, given the potential possibilities. And I was a bit surprised to see that there wasn't quite as much of that as I had hoped. There certainly is a lot, but in many cases, folks were defaulting to pretty much plutocratic approaches. Whoever has the most tokens gets to the most votes, and they can often carry the day. And I've spent a lot of time thinking about alternatives to those approaches and the lack of constraints in some areas around Web3, combined with folks looking for ways to get new things done, inspired me to take the things that I've learned through my attempts to try to make regular organizations more successful and apply them to DAOs. And that's what resulted in the playbook. And I'm always glad to hear when folks are trying to take the contents of it and try to apply it. It's something that I've certainly wanted to encourage in terms of just being able to help organizations be successful in achieving their purposes. So it's great to be here talking with you today about how to help you all make that happen.
Thanks, Pupil. This is an open mic, so it's really free flowing for everyone in the room to jump in. Maybe I'll just tease out for everyone. I mean, some of you I know are familiar with the Playbook more intimately. Aya, John, maybe others probably haven't seen it at all. There's a link in the chat. So within the voice channel, you'll be able to see a little chat box, and that's an area where we can chat during the call. But maybe I can give a stab, Pupil, at a high-level summary of how I understand the Playbook approaches the challenge. It's kind of this idea of a community forming, and I'm not sure. It's a question I have of how directly it ties to your work at the Orca protocol. I mean, there seem to be some similarities, although maybe it's not super tied. It's just structurally similar, conceptually similar. My sense is that there's this timeline upon which a community creates like a parent DAO, like, fundraises in some capacity a certain treasury, and then that treasury and those persons are used to spin up multiple child DAOs. And the Playbook walks through, sort of step 1, step 2, step 3, and each of those child DAOs is meant to be a kind of standalone project or a group that would receive some funds from the parent DAO, generate their own kind of DAOs, child DAO specific tokens or NFTs. So there's a whole mechanic there around auctions, and maybe you could describe that a little bit in this meeting, but that there's a linked tokenomics that's sort of multifaceted that connects the parent DAO with all the child DAOs, so that there's this like shared economic system that aligns everyone, but that each child DAO is independent, and through this process that's outlined in the Playbook, there's a determination made as to whether this child DAO or this child project is viable, and then can kind of spin off and go and live its life, and that there's a period of time then at which the whole exercise, I don't know if it is 99 episodes or something like that, that the whole process ends and the parent DAO dissolves and no longer exists, and there's other triggers that could dissolve the whole experiment earlier in time. And so I thought that this was a kind of really interesting system. How did I do in terms of describing?
That's pretty good. And I would add there that one of the keys to thinking about the approach to the Playbook is that it really puts purpose at the heart of everything that goes on around a DAO. The idea of it is that a person or a group of people, whether they're already involved with a group, whether they're involved with a DAO, another kind of organization, that have a shared purpose, something that they want to see manifest in the world, what I refer to in the Playbook as an adventure vision for what the future might look like, can come together and put resources and their skills into service towards that vision. And the idea there is that this playbook provides a structure for being able to help folks that don't necessarily want to have to get weighed down with all of the minutia around how to set up a DAO, how to set up tokenomics, how to structure voting, how to organize day-to-day activities, to take a lot of that sort of burden off of the shoulders of those folks and allow them to focus their energy on how do we make the most progress towards the adventure vision, and how do we make sure that we have the resources going to the right place and the right decision makers involved at the right capacities to move us in that direction. And a big piece of this is being able to not only direct the activities of the DAO itself, but also being able to embrace more of a reproduction kind of paradigm. So the idea is that by creating spin-offs and by having a defined life cycle for the DAO, it creates urgency and it creates a method for being able to allow the group to, when it grows and is successful, to be able to add to the vision and to be able to sanction new ways to approach driving the vision, so that ultimately you end up with a catalyst for a larger movement towards that adventure vision that can encompass many different groups of people, some of whom may be involved in multiple areas, some that are maybe only be involved in one or two, that can all effectively coordinate in order to bring the adventure vision to life.
Yeah, that's something I think that really fits with conversations we've been having. You know, Christian, last month you were pointing out how local small groups, and I think all of us have probably experienced in one shape or form in our contributions in Web3 that, as communities grow in size, and the plutocracy that you also do want to get into the tokenomics, but so this idea, this composability of communities and being able to operate as sort of small groups of, some people call it sub DAOs, I've called it satellite DAOs, child DAOs. Just wondering what others on the call are thinking about what we've been discussing so far. What's coming up, or any questions or thoughts you want to double click on.
One of the there's a couple things that I was really inspired by in the playbook. One is the adventure vision and its basis in vision's role, mission, goals. From Tom Graves' work, I believe it's Tom Graves.
Yep.
And I read Graves' work and it was interesting, but it was actually doing deeper research, finding other people teaching his work where it fully landed. And now I just go like, this is too visionary because people aren't going to do the research to really get it, because some of the power and depth of that purpose to find that way. Like I was researching some new, I'm not sure if they were a company or an actual DAO, but let's just say protocol today. And they had mission, vision, values, which is what we're used to seeing. And I just realized that's completely marketing, because the amazing thing about vision, adventure vision, role for the organization, mission, and goals is that this literally leaves kind of the organizational memory audit trail when done correctly, so that it's very straightforward for everybody to pay attention and notice if what's happening is really in alignment with what we're supposed to be doing, right? And another beautiful thing about that uh, way of expressing alignment in a way that's audible is that, oh geez, Oh, the guy that talks about why. Forget his name right now.
Simon Sinek.
Yes, that way of thinking maps very well, and I think better onto this way of defining how an organization should be thinking about itself than the whole mission, vision, values way, in which things are kind of more market speak and feel good, and then people just do business in kind of habitual ways, whatever, you know, people learned either building something or from previous experience. And when that depth of understanding of vision, role, mission, goals really hit, I was just like, damn. I mean, it's great, but it's almost like unless people are reading the document and then following up the resources like their PhD students, really getting some of the shift in thinking, I think it's going to be totally missed. And yeah, and the other thing that I always have loved about it was the use of different well-known and comprehensible governance styles for different aspects of governance within the organization. And then reading Landry's work on that, that was really easy to get like, oh, why this makes total sense. And from that, I have thought this is an experiment that needs to happen, and it would be great to the way Pupil has created the document filled with ideas. It would be great to create the infrastructure so people don't have to like try and focus on how do we set this up to do it so that we can like focus on what our real adventure vision is. So that is something definitely in my mind, and I know John's, about trying to possibly do is like create the infrastructure so that others not only have this written outline of steps to take, but here's literally all the tools and some more ideas filling in what's not in the playbook about, you know, really having organizations work well in the human element and be supported with the tools of technology in doing so. But it's a lot to take in because, like, I hadn't read it again till recently, and then doing more research. But I didn't realize until recently how much I had missed. So I'm, yeah, put in my place.
So, a question I have is how can we get started? So, we're having this call. You can post the document. It's still hard to digest and think about what's next. And to map on what we've had going on in ACRE DAOs this year to a particular structure. So, like, quote, reimagining impact investing. What that looks like are things we've talked about, or the necessity of DAOs having a business model or sustainability model, and what that looks like. But where do we need, as a broad tokenized community, to define the adventure vision, and then how specific should that be versus the adventure vision that each child DAO proposer would have for its particular project? And is the first step like a reading group to go through the references and really study this, and have maybe like a core team that's a working group on? Because I appreciate your point. Like, I think the philosophy and the sentiment and the education that went into this is probably not a terrible background for some core group of people to really have as we begin to try and model an architecture for this community?
Well, that's really the key question, isn't it? I mean, ultimately, the reason that the playbook exists is to support and inspire action. So, my hope is that not everybody within the community decides to lock themselves in a closet for 3 months and read this and not actually do anything. That would certainly be a tragedy. I would say that the the starting point for this is around the adventure vision. And the idea around the adventure vision is something that is transformative enough and big enough to provide space for everyone to be able to see a place for them to play a role in bringing that to life. In an ideal world, we would be able to define an adventure vision big enough to encompass everything that all of the stakeholders within ACRE DAOs uh, and would want to embrace around this, because that then provides, the bigger the vision, the more space and roles that there are to be able to play in that, and also not just for the existing community, but also for those who may come in the future. No one likes to be the last person at the party that only gets the soggy chips on the tray and watered down, beverages in the case, right? Everybody wants to be able to come to this and see enough on the table to be able to take their own place within the broader approach. So the key thing that you can do that would really cause you to suffer in the future would be to think too small in terms of the original adventure vision. Now, part of the design of the model is that if that occurs, okay, well then, we either achieve that, at which point we can, wind things down and move on to other things, or we might realize this isn't really working, and that again prompts us to shift to, okay, let's wind this down and let's start something else up. So one of the key constraints that has existed within traditional organizations is that it's expensive to bring people together and to wind them down. Bankruptcy is not a trivial matter. It's not something that you get done in 10 minutes and then you can go do something else like you could if you're at a party and you get bored with the party and you just decide to go down the street and go hang out, and you can have a party there. Web3 is much closer to the party mentality rather than a company mentality in terms of what it takes in order to wind things down, start things up. Therefore, it's crucial that we take advantage of that by being able to regularly review where we are and say, this isn't really working for me, and then go to do something else. Having said that, of course, if we can define that adventure vision broadly enough to where it inspires the entire community to all then look for the way that they can play a role in being successful with that, and for folks to be able to sort out what sorts of role or roles that they want to play in that vision, then that makes it much easier to then start to form those small communities that can then drive missions and goals against those roles. And that will then start to create more building blocks that can be used by the entire community in order to get more things done. It'll inspire new experiments, new things to be developed that can ultimately be spun off into their own DAOs that can then further advance against the adventure vision and a unique role there. So that broader landscape provides opportunity for everyone. And it provides opportunity for folks that want to get into the theory and think through these sorts of things and want to focus on those aspects. It provides space for the folks that just want to take action against the particular injustice or issue that they're really concerned about, and they don't want to have to worry about all these other sorts of things. It provides an opportunity for all those folks to be able to find their place, to be able to take action, learn what works, what does not, to be able to grow and change, to potentially start up their own DAOs against that adventure vision, to join other DAOs, to partner with others, to do all the different things that allow them to achieve their full potential.
So if we say, and it's very clear the document does say, we start with purpose, which is the adventure vision. One
Mm-hmm.
thing that's not clear, there's one adventure vision. Are there one, too many possible roles? I know that in an adventure vision, there's definitely possibility for multiple missions,
Mm-hmm.
right? And then, of course, the missions get broken down into real time specific goals. But it's not clear to me, unless you're thinking about like really big company, do you think of more than one role? Like, is it one, two, three, many roles that should be thought about after you come up with a good adventure vision? Or
I would
really?
say that for most DAOs, it's going to make the most sense to start with one.
Yeah, that's what I would think too.
Yeah. And I mean, this is an experiment. And while this document doesn't explicitly say V 1.0 on it, it's certainly, none of this should be construed as saying, yeah, I figured this all out and it will never need to change. Only idiots and madmen, or both, would make those sorts of statements. And while I've been called both at various times, I try not to stick to that nowadays. So uh, that may be one of the things that folks experiment with, is to say, well, we really have both of these roles that we see that we can play in this vision. Let's try to do both within a single DAO rather than splitting into two separate DAOs, each of which would take on one of those roles. My inclination would be to say that it's probably better to focus, but I could be wrong about that. Perhaps there's some synergies from being able to work amongst multiple roles, even in a small group, that make that more worthwhile. Perhaps there are times where it makes sense to do one versus the other. We just don't know yet.
That
Can
kind
you
of
just question? Could you expound on roles versus vision? I'm not sure I fully understand the
Yeah.
discussion you both are having on that point.
Yeah. So when we say an adventure vision, what we mean by that is just the notion of what is the future that we're wanting to bring about as a broader organization. The way that I frame it up in the playbook is to say that this is a very brief summary, often no more than half a dozen words, about the what, how, and why that the DAO aspires to play a part of bringing into existence. So it's a statement that says to the world, this is what interests us, and if this interests you too, perhaps you should join us. So the idea is that, if we are talking about food security, for instance, and our adventure vision may just be that no child would ever go hungry. It may just be something as straightforward as that. That could probably be refined to be a more effective statement, but that's the kind of uh, adventure vision that we're talking about there. Now, within that, of course, the role that I might play in that is that perhaps I am growing food and perhaps I'm researching ways to make it easier to increase the yields of food, or perhaps I'm focused on improving distribution, or maybe I want to be the role I want to play is to actually uh, put food into the hands of people and actually be able to help them that directly. It's the role that we play within that vision is what is it that we want to do in order to help bring that to life. And of course, we all play roles in our day-to-day life. And it's just about choosing in the context of that adventure vision, what do we want to play in helping to uh, make that a reality or bring that closer to reality.
Got it. I think I'm getting such a better, I think, picture of this, and in context of ACRE DAOs, it's starting to feel. I'd like to hear from others, like, maybe approaching this experiment as like a pilot within the community, so not trying to map the entire organization onto it and figuring that out. So not necessarily coming up with what is the ACRE DAO's adventure vision, but just continue with status quo, and within that, with who's here, figure out what people who are here, or who might come, maybe more specifically want to do. I mean, if you've seen our Discord, we have like the 7 quote impact categories. There's a couple of projects underway that potentially could be candidates. A trust fund for everyone. I don't know. The Doer Money DAO idea. Other things that we've met, sort of conceptualized. But what do folks think? Is that does it feel like, from what we're hearing, that maybe something much more specific, kind of a pilot, would be the way to approach this? It has less pressure, it can be more experimental, and the scale of it can vary, right? Like, people, I once remember asking you, so how many people would you need in the parent DAO? Like, what's the minimum viable number of individuals to play these various roles? And what's interesting to me, you were kind of like, well, you could have one person, which makes things go really quickly. So like, I just love to hear what other folks' reactions are to maybe the idea of designing a playbook pilot or like experiment that doesn't attempt to be all things to everything we as a broader community can be, but just gives us a way to try it out.
Kianga, it's Christian. I mean, I think that makes a lot of sense. I mean, particularly because I think one thing that you and I probably agree on is that, for better or worse, DAOs need a degree of leadership, right? Somebody needs to kind of step up and say, okay, here's a plan. And I think by putting that out, you're able to potentially attract people, as opposed to just having kind of a whiteboard that people just kind of throw things on, but are not necessarily taking a leadership role in doing. I couldn't tell you what the right topic is, but it seems to me that, and to me, that I think that was the question I had for people, is just to, how do you, in this concept of a DAO, how do you find the people that are willing to step up? Because frankly, at least my experience is most people aren't. I'll give you an opinion, but that's about it.
Yeah, that's part of the mechanism of this, I guess you could say, is that this is certainly not designed. I mean, the reason that this is called a playbook for impact DAOs and not just a playbook for DAOs is because there's a lot of DAOs that this doesn't make sense for. It would not make sense for MakerDAO to start trying to implement this tomorrow. The scale, there's so many things that are around that just wouldn't work here. But the notion that you all are talking about around, let's just try an experiment, let's try a pilot, let's not commit everything that we're doing to try to operate within this structure, makes a tremendous amount of sense. This is one thing that I would encourage you to do, is to not worry about, am I doing the right thing or not around this? Is this the right first thing for us to be able to experiment on, or am I doing this the right way? The most important thing that you can be looking for is someone who's willing to take action and can communicate clearly what they're trying to do to others so that they can join in. And the playbook is just intended to be able to provide a common language for that. And my hope is that those experiments, of course, would turn out well, and that those then catalyze more and more around this space, so that it becomes a bit self-sustaining in that aspect. But even if the initial experiment doesn't yield a long-lasting DAO, it'll still yield important lessons and relationships, perhaps. As many of you know, in the Orca protocol group that John, and I were Orcanauts in, that the Orcanaut program is no longer active. That doesn't mean that it was a failure, though, because one of the things that we've gotten out of that are relationships that we wouldn't have had otherwise, that may turn into fabulous things in the future. So the only wrong thing to be doing in terms of trying to get started with the playbook is either to do nothing at all or do things and refuse to learn from them. As long as you're not doing those things, there will be success of some kind. And even if it doesn't yield tangible progress against the adventure vision with what you do first, as the widely attributed quote to Edison was, that you just learned another way that you can't light a light bulb. So you find others. And it may be that we figure out that some of the stuff in here is complete bunk and doesn't actually work within this community, and we need to do other things. And there's no reason not to take what works out of this and use it and change things that don't, and experiment and continue to learn and evolve the work.
Thank you for that. I completely agree with you on your 2 points, particularly the first, and just doing it and then learning from it. So I guess, Yanga, it makes sense to me to have a specific project that is identified to be used to implement, and it will obviously require a degree of sufficient description and something that gets people excited, right? Because ultimately, you don't want it just being something that one person ends up having to do. It needs to attract a lot of different people that bring on a different set of skills and bring different time commitments and the like. But I think that makes perfect sense. And as you said, people, you experiment, right? It's all about, this whole process is about experimentation. That's why it's interesting. And to your point about having companies go into bankruptcy, with the DAO, even as a contributor to a DAO, you can step in, step out, step in, step out, step in, step out. You can do lots of different things. You could get fired and still end up working in the DAO, right? So what kind of DAO do you get fired and you end up working in anyway? So there's just the possibilities are really actually endless, and I think you just sometimes, and this is more to myself than to the audience, but sometimes you just need to take that first step and create something and see what happens.
That's what I was going to say too. It's just about taking action, really, having a bias for action, because there's a roadmap. I do have a question about the roadmap, having reread it recently. People, in the introductory part, you literally talk about a clear separation between, governance actions, what I call R&D, and I think you talk about as prototype development or something like that, and operational performance.
Yep.
I can make up why for me, but I'd like to know why you wrote it.
Well, that's always the interesting bit, right? Is when folks really dig into your words and you're like, did I actually say that? It's amazing how you can slave over the words, and then so soon after they're written, it's like, oh man, I don't remember any of that. But the division between governance and development and ongoing operations, the reason that those are split out is because they're very different ways of working, and they're intended to accomplish different purposes. Governance is ultimately about being able to guide the organization in the direction that's going to provide the most value against the adventure vision that's been laid out. So in the classic organizational governance literature. It's about things like evaluating, directing, monitoring the actions of the organization, understanding benefits, costs, and risks, and how do we get the best trade-offs between them, and those sorts of items. The whole notion around development and the different phases there around that are, in order to make progress against the adventure vision, we've got to bring new things into the world. We have to figure out whether they're feasible. We have to be able to make those items profitable, and then we have to be able to scale those innovations. And then, of course, once we actually have those in use, then actually running those on a day-to-day different basis requires a different set of skills. There's different kinds of decisions that we're trying to make, different kinds of actions that we're trying to take. So one of the reasons for clearly separating out those elements is to provide the space for each of those activities to be performed and performed well, while minimizing the amount of confusion and mess that can often exist within traditional organizations within those spaces. So the idea of that is just that by providing a cleaner separation in the tokenomics and the mechanics of doing that work, it's easier for folks that are primarily interested in one or two of those areas rather than all, to be able to just focus their energy there. And it also makes it easier for those that are interested in the overall organization to focus their actions on a moment-to-moment basis.
So then is the difference between governance and performance of ongoing activities? Because yeah, actually that was the harder one for me to understand why clear separation, because it seemed like if it's just about one is into the weeds enough that it really isn't governance level, but should be somebody implementing policy that was set by governance, I get it. But if it was other than that, it wasn't as clear to me why. I mean, you were with us in Orca where, because we were flying and building, we were doing governance, and I guess performance of ongoing activities was more, tracked by the pod, so it was still separate. But so that really is kind of the distinction between, you give a certain amount of responsibility to a team and they just do what they do, with trust that it's fitting in the governance vision, and the governance is actually explicitly making decisions to keep the entire group in alignment with visions, roles, and missions.
Yeah, so the way that I would frame this up is there's a, kind of one of the tropes that exists in traditional management literature is about the distinction of the difference between doing things right and doing the right things. You can roughly map that onto the notion of doing the right things is what governance is about. Are these the things that we need to be doing in order to advance towards the adventure vision, to best bring it to life? Whereas operational activities are ultimately about doing things right. Are we doing these things in the best way that we can do them? And in many organizations, it's often unclear whenever things are not going well. Is it because we're doing the right things, but we're just not executing? Or is it that we're actually doing the wrong things, and no matter how well we do them, we're never going to get where we want to get because we're just going in the right direction. We're going in the wrong direction. So part of the reason for the separation around that is to make sure that at any given point that we're able to very clearly focus on what is it that we're trying to accomplish here. Is it about choosing which things that we're going to do and what we should do? Or is it about executing against those things? Because often when we mix those things up in a single work stream, it's very easy for folks to get off track, to start doing other things, to get very confused around that. So that's one of the elements that is crucial to have a clear separation of, so that we can distinguish those conversations and make sure that we're able to ideally, of course, accomplish both, that we're doing the right things and also we're doing them as well as we can.
Thank you.
I wanted to ask about the digital assets and the tokenomics, and if you could share how you think that works in the incentive structure. I love this distinction you just drew. Very helpful. Doing the right things, having the incentive to care.
Mm-hmm.
Because yeah, I mean that gets interesting when there are competing priorities. You know, I think at a certain scale and with governance in a very open system, extraction of value or conflicts of interest, you know, there aren't maybe the kinds of protections that
Mm-hmm.
the corporate world has worked out are appropriate. So how could you describe like how the assets and who in the structure holds or earns which assets and how that factors into the equation, and then relatedly what should we be thinking about in terms of like I don't know if I say sex appeal or like greed. I
Mm-hmm.
mean the things that drive crypto,
Yep.
and the speculation, which is very helpful. And how, and I think we in the impact space or regenerative economy. I mean, John, we were commenting on this, like it's maybe a little bit dry. Maybe it's like not that interesting, or it's so mission driven that people don't necessarily think, oh, I can make money here, and that's also our challenge. I think to get some of the momentum, you see, the climate or the impact projects that have got the
Mm-hmm.
most momentum. I mean, these are not some of the things that we want to be doing. So that's like a big chunk of questions, but basically how the digital assets in the structure work, what are they, and how you feel that they participate in the successful execution.
There is a high risk that I will go on way longer on this topic than anyone wants me to actually talk. So feel free to step in once you've reached the point of
Let it
no
let it
longer
rip.
wanting to hear. All right.
Let it rip.
Okay. So you've asked a big question. I'll do my best to deliver a useful answer around it. Let's start by just talking about the nature of incentives. One of the explicit elements that I looked at in the criteria of designing the playbook was to work with rather than against participant motivations. That was the second thing I had listed about what would be a viable approach to doing any of this stuff beyond right after the purpose. So very important around these items. Just like in for individuals where the gap between what we say that we want and what we actually succumb to often is vast and stark. We see the same thing at a group level. So anytime that we can work with the motivations of individuals, of groups of people, that is going to help us to be more successful than if we try to expect people to be angels rather than human beings. And if there's one thing that's clear about effective design of DAOs is that we have to design DAOs that human beings can actually operate in and work in. If everybody has to be a saint, we're not going to get very far because those are pretty few and far between on the ground. So an important design aspect of everything in the structure is reflected through the notion of incentives. It's one of the things that I spend ridiculously way too much time thinking about. So the idea of how to best harness incentives to get maximum progress towards the adventure vision while also respecting the fact that every person participating also has motivations to achieve success in whatever terms that they define them. That led to one clear aspect that came to my mind, which is that you can't just use a single token and expect that to be able to address all of the different incentive challenges. So that led to the use of 3 types of tokens in the tokenomics around this. The first kind is around what I call the DAO Gov NFTs. And a DAO Gov NFT is essentially the holder of the purpose and what is it that we're doing against the purpose. You can think of them as being they are the governance arm of the organization that is actually making the decisions about, is what we're doing in line with the adventure vision, and what should we be doing in order to drive that, as well as who should be in the major decision-making roles that we have within the DAO to help us to achieve that, and evaluating their performance to make sure that we have the right people in place in order to drive that structure. Now, these token holders have no mechanism through the playbook to actually achieve any sort of return on any resources that they put in for exchange for their governance token for their NFT. Their return is in being able to actually have the maximum amount of influence on achieving the vision, which ideally, of course, also reduces the incentive to subvert the adventure vision in favor of personal gain, because they don't have a mechanism through holding the DAO Gov token of being able to achieve that. Now, of course, that doesn't mean that those folks can only hold those sorts of tokens, because, in a world where you can have pseudonyms, there's no way you could actually enforce that anyway. So it's pointless to try to design or require that as a restriction. So the mechanism for DAO Gov holders who want to be able to somehow achieve a financial return as well as progress towards the adventure vision would be that they would need to involve themselves with one of the other 2 types of tokens that are involved with this. So one of those would be what I cheekily referred to as DAO Appt NFTs, APPT, because I am terrible about making up. So the idea of the NFTs is that is the mechanism for those who want to put resources into the DAO, but aren't necessarily looking to put their time and attention and energy directly into the DAO, to be able to provide a way of supporting the adventure vision through financial contribution. And from that, of course, also being able to potentially profit from that if the DAO develops offerings that end up becoming valuable, or if the NFT itself becomes desirable as a status symbol, or because it's beautiful artwork, or whatever other reasons exist for folks to hold NFTs today. And there's nothing in here that precludes anyone from using it for those purposes. But the idea is that there's a regular distribution of those NFTs that are auctioned off. Those then yield resources that are contributed to the DAO that the DAO Gov holders can then direct towards the adventure vision. So those folks, the Appt NFT holders have no ability to provide any sort of voting direction around what work is being done within the DAO, or what decisions are to be made, who's in charge, none of that. They have zero responsibilities regarding that. It's purely either I'm giving you this money because I believe in the adventure vision and I want to contribute resources to making that happen, or I think that this can be potentially lucrative and therefore I want to hold it to get a piece of the action, or ideally both. So it gives a way for those that are motivated by either of those to contribute, even if they don't have the energy or the attention or time to make any other kind of contribution to the adventure vision. Now, for those that want to contribute their attention and time and focus, but don't necessarily have resources to contribute in the financial sense, that would be where then what we refer to as the DAO MT tokens would come into play. So these are the fungible tokens that are used to essentially serve primarily as a compensation mechanism for those who conduct the work of the DAO and actually help to bring about the services and offerings and deliver them into the wider world, as well as, of course, powering the prediction market and prediction management capabilities to help with the decision making around the DAO. But the idea there is that even for folks that have no money that they or no resources that they want to or can contribute to the DAO, but want to contribute their energy, their focus, their activity towards the adventure vision. This gives them a mechanism for being able to do that. It gives them a mechanism for also being able to provide increasing levels of input on decision making as part of their contribution, as well as being able to get a financial return from the energy and time that they're investing in that. So again, here, people may be primarily taking action and contributing because they believe in the adventure vision and they want to take the actions that they believe will help to bring that to life. Or they may be participating because they see that it could be financially rewarding to do so and are contributing their attention and time for that reason, or again, ideally both. And by doing that, they then have the ability to also participate around this. So each of these tokens have different roles that they play within the organization. None of them are ones that would serve as the traditional plutocratic, whoever gets the most votes gets to make the decision around this. So the decision-making mechanism is not the same as it would be in a typical DAO. But the idea is that each of these token holders have certain rights and contributions that they're making towards the adventure vision, and they can get benefits from doing that ideally align with the things that matter most to them.
Woo! That was great. That was great. Well, I'm glad we got that in. Mindful of the time, the clock just turned to 8:30, and at least in my time zone, and I think some of you are also. It's 8:30, and so I want to not overstay our welcome on your calendar. To be continued, people. Thank you so much. This has really helped me, and I think there's a lot that's in flight at ACRE DAOs that we can leverage here. I mean, we have a community token. I've been thinking a lot about the regulatory picture and structuring things very intentionally to avoid securities designation and all of that. And I think what you've laid out is like really achievable and with a bunch of structure that we already have in place and some assets that we already have. And so let's continue this conversation, everyone, in the Discord, and I'll follow up with some specific reflections, and particularly, our application to C Club that John, Aya, and I submitted the other week, which, if we were to be selected, could really maybe be a great place to locate our pilot. But we'll explore that, because obviously there's many ways we can go with this. Any last words from anyone before we say adieu? To you
Thank
and
you,
you and you.
Nyanga and Acre Invest crew.
Yeah, thanks for looking at this and considering the use of this, and for the great discussion. Really enjoyed it, and of course, happy to continue to keep the conversation going, and very keen to see where this experiment ends up over time.
Cool. All right. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
Until next time. Good night.